Inner tubes. They don't cost a huge amount of money, but along with tyres, they're one of the biggest bang for your buck upgrades that you can make. Not just in regards to the weight, but also, and more importantly, about the rolling resistance too.
Cyclists have long known about the importance of rolling resistance, especially when selecting tyres for time trials, races, but even just general riding. As far back as the 70s and 80s, riders were picking special, indoor-specific velodrome tyres to use in outdoor time trials because they knew they were thinner and faster. A high rolling resistance means that you will have to put out more power to travel the same speed, whereas a lower rolling resistance means you could put out less power to travel that same speed.
So in this video, we're going to look at the relative pros and cons of all the different inner tube types that are out there and explain the differences between them.
Let's begin with the different types of tube and how much they typically cost. Starting with butyl tubes.
These come in a variety of different thicknesses. You've got big chunky ones for gravel and mountain bikes, and you've got thinner ones as well, which are suited towards road bikes. And they also come in different thicknesses because you can get some super lightweight ones.
For example, Pirelli makes its standard kind of sport tube and then a lighter, thinner one that they call the road tube. Other brands make even thinner and lighter ones than that, but more on that in a sec. Typically, butyl tubes cost around £2 to £5, euros or dollars, depending on the exact type you're buying and how many you're buying. If you buy in bulk, it can be a bit cheaper.
Next up, latex tubes, Ollie's favourite. And as the name suggests, these are made from latex rubber and are available by a number of different brands.
They're usually pink or sometimes green, but they're not black like butyl tubes. And they're a bit more expensive than butyl tubes, typically costing around £10 to £12, euros or dollars.
Again, this depends on how many you buy, because you could be cheaper buying them in bulk. And then we've got the relative new kids on the block, TPU inner tubes, which is a thermoplastic and it's made from polyurethane.
Yes, and again, a number of brands make these, but this is Pirelli's version. It's called a smart tube, incredibly light, the lightest of the three options, but also usually the most expensive. They typically cost around £17 to £25, euros or dollars, depending on where you get it from, the exact tube you get.
There is, of course, always the fourth option as well, and that is to not use any of the above options and go for a tubeless tyre setup.
You love tubeless.
Yeah, did I mention I love tubeless tyres? But anyway, we won't cover that here. We've covered that in lots of other videos.
Yeah, it's a completely separate, different topic, but we do have videos on it. Having established the different types of inner tubes, we're now going to talk about rolling resistance. Because if you're trying to be as fast as possible and performance is your reason for being, then your number one consideration when selecting inner tubes should be rolling resistance.
It's the interaction between the inner tube that you've got fitted inside your tyre and the tyre itself which dictates your rolling resistance. You can in fact feel the difference between a slow setup and a fast setup. One of the most comprehensive studies into inner tube rolling resistance was conducted by our good friends Aerocoach. This is an independent study where they quite simply aim to find the lowest rolling resistance inner tubes.
The take-home message from the results? Resistance is butyl.
These tests showed that the Vredestein latex...
No, seriously, it is.
They showed that the Vredestein latex inner tube was the fastest, so this had the lowest rolling resistance, and then was closely followed by the Vittoria latex inner tube, and then the Challenge inner tube as well, again a latex one. And these saved on average 7 watts for a pair of wheels compared to a standard butyl tube, which is not good saving, isn't it?
Yes, now especially considering the cost. 7 watts equates to roughly 12 seconds saved in a 16-kilometre or 10-mile time trial, according to Aerocoach. But it might not sound like much to you, but it could be the difference between winning or losing. And also if you extrapolate that over the course of a longer ride, it could be a lot of time indeed. Studies have also been carried out independently by bicyclerolling-resistance.com, and they've come up with similar results to Aerocoach, which is encouraging. And as for the TPU inner tubes, well, both the studies tend to suggest that these fall somewhere in between the latex tube and the butyl tube for rolling resistance. So typically a couple of watts faster than butyl and a couple of watts slower than latex.
But what about the weight? Because the weight is another consideration that we need to take into account. Many of us cyclists are obsessed over the weight of the components of our bikes.
Yeah, and the lightest inner tubes by far, it's a win for the TPU. I mean, these things are ridiculous. Like, there's even a picture of a feather on the box, but when you weigh it, you know, like 35 grams, outrageous. When you compare that to a standard butyl tube, I mean, 138 grams. So massive watt saving. And although, you know, when it comes to, you know, these being considerably more expensive than these, in a kind of like cost per gram saving you're doing, the difference in weight here is like £1,000 if you're talking in wheels or bike frames.
Yeah, it is. So, yeah, it's very true. A similar size latex inner tube weighs in around 75 grams and sits somewhere in the middle between the TPU and the butyl inner tube, so such as that pink one there that Ollie's got.
Now, if you go for a more performance butyl tube, well, the weight comes down, like we mentioned, so around sort of 80 grams, comparable to the latex tube. And then if you go for a super light, super thin butyl tube, they're usually around 50 grams, so lighter still, but still not quite as light as the TPU.
But how much difference does this weight actually make?
I'm glad you asked that, Alex. So if you saved around 160 grams across your two inner tubes by switching to lighter ones when travelling up a 16% gradient, that would equate to around 0.8 of a watt saved. Well, it's still a gain, or 0.03 kilometers an hour. So not much at all. And it's important to point out that the watts saved from rolling resistance counts for more than what you're saving from weight in this situation. Yeah. So if you remember, even with the TPU tube, 2 watts slower in terms of rolling resistance versus 0.8 of a watt saved in weight, but you're not even saving that much because the latex tube is actually not much heavier.
Rolling resistance trumps weight. Next up, braking. Now, if you're using disc brakes, you can use whatever type of inner tubes you like. However, if you're using rim brakes, you do need to be a bit mindful because on prolonged braking, on long descents, you will build up some heat inside the rims, and you do need to be mindful of what inner tubes you're using because some of them are not recommended for rim brakes.
Yes, some inner tubes can fail when prolonged to the heat build-up, and I would, yes, as Alex says, look at what the manufacturer recommends. For example, Continental recommends that its super thin, light, butyl supersonic inner tubes are not used in hilly terrain. Next, we're going to discuss practicality, beginning with air retention, and there is a clear winner here, and it is butyl. So if you want anything for an easy life and you don't want to have to pump up your tyres every single day and you want them to hold air, butyl tubes, they're the way to go. The other 2 tube types leak air at increasing rates, so next comes TPU, and then lagging behind is latex. If you use latex tubes and you want to have the right tyre pressure, you're going to have to pump them up pretty much every single day. There's other implications for this, such as if you're riding a back-to-back multi-day event, maybe something like the Transcontinental, and you don't necessarily want to pump up your tyres every day, well, latex might be something to reconsider. Or if you're racking your bike ahead of a race the next day, often is the case in triathlons, then yes, again, factor in that your tyre pressure is going to be less when you start your event than when you racked your bike the day before.
And if you want an inner tube that's faster than a standard butyl inner tube, but you don't want to have to pump your tyres up every single time, then the TPU or thermoplastic inner tube is the way to go. These do still, however, leak a little bit of air slowly over time because they are still porous, but it's at a much slower rate than what a latex one does.
Yeah, as shown by a cool study done by bicyclerollingresistance.com.
And remember, the TPU inner tube has the added benefit of being that little bit lighter, because it's not just the weight of the inner tubes inside your tyres, it's also the weight of the inner tube that you're carrying around in your spare, so in your saddlebag or your pocket, for example.
As for punctures, well, it depends on who you ask. Some people will say these inner tubes puncture more, and some people will say these inner tubes puncture more. But we've not seen any quantitative scientific data that suggests that any particular inner tube punctures more than another. That said, you would expect that a slightly thicker butyl heavy-duty tube is going to offer a tiny bit more protection than a super light kind of supersonic 50-gram one. But in our experience, again, the thing that makes the biggest difference to punctures is the tyre carcass and the tyre you're using rather than the inner tube that's in it.
And if you do suffer a puncture, butyl inner tubes are easily repairable with standard patches that are easily available. And you can also use those same patches on latex inner tubes. However, if you are patching a latex inner tube, something that I have seen people do is use an old latex tube to cut up and form their own patch and then stick that on the latex tube. TPU inner tubes, however, are also repairable. This is something that you didn't know until today.
No, I didn't know about this.
So there are a couple of brands out there that make repair kits for this type of inner tube, and well, they're just repaired in a very similar process to what you would do with a standard inner tube.
That said, if you've had a blowout and your inner tube is torn and ripped to shreds, as can sometimes happen unfortunately, then they're not repairable.
No.
Installation. Butyl tubes, clear winner again. They're the easiest tubes to install into your tyres. TPU, they're pretty easy too, but latex are noticeably a bit more of a faff. I mean, latex tubes, they are more delicate, meaning it can be easy to break them when you install them. What often happens is people bang them in their tyres and then they pump them up to 100 psi. They're all excited because they've just got latex tubes. And a little bit of the tubes got caught under the bead of the tyre, causing it to go bang as soon as they've pumped it up, which is quite scary. Also, if you're installing them, don't use tyre levers, as this can very easily, because they're delicate, just nick the tube and put a tiny hole in it and then
A neat little tip that many people can do is just to inflate the inner tube very slightly so that it holds its shape, and that way, as you're putting it into the tyre, you reduce the risk of pinching it when you're fitting the tyre on or using your tyre lever as well.
And before you do go to fully inflate a latex tube, always check that it's no part of it around the rim is caught under the bead of the tyre in any way. Latex tubes are not just more physically delicate, they're more chemically delicate too. So be careful not to let them get into contact with solvents and chemicals, as that can easily damage them.
Something else that you should also be mindful of, particularly if you're at the roadside pumping your tyres up, is when using a CO2 cartridge, for example. Now, this isn't a problem that I've had myself, but I have heard in the past when using a CO2 cartridge, it makes the latex inner tube go quite brittle, and then you run the risk of it failing.
Yeah, so a simple solution would be that in your spares bag that you carry with you on your rides, put in either a TPU tube or a butyl tube rather than a latex tube.
Now, we've covered a lot so far, but what about ride quality? This is particularly hard to disseminate, and I have heard some riders saying they prefer the ride feel of a latex inner tube because it's far more supple and it conforms and deforms to the road surface far more. But I can't say this is something that I've been able to tell in the past, but something that I do think has a far greater importance is the tyre pressure and the tyre width.
However, what is definitely perceptible is the feeling of speed you get if you switch from a slow rolling winter tyre and big thick butyl tube to a really fast racing tyre and a latex tube. I mean, it's night and day. The difference can easily be something in the region of 25 watts. And that, I mean, if you ride it back to back, trust us, you're welcome to try it. You'll be able to feel the difference.
In summary, if you're racing or doing time trialing, then latex inner tubes could be the way to go. But if you're just doing general purpose riding or riding off road perhaps, then the butyl inner tube could be the one for you.
It's also the lowest cost option and doesn't need regular inflation, anything for an easy life. But if you're going to be racing uphill or riding on back-to-back days where you don't want to have to be inflating your tyres, or just a mad weight weenie, then TPU tubes, this is the way.
Hopefully you enjoyed hearing our thoughts on all the different types of inner tubes that are available, and why not let us know your thoughts on them in the comment section down below.
And remember, resistance is butyl, and if you'd like that on a t-shirt, then we will get Resistance is Butyl t-shirts made. What should we say? If this video gets 200,000 views.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
Yeah? So if you do want a Resistance is Butyl t-shirt, then, well, I guess share this video with all your friends.
I'll watch it a lot of times.
Yeah.
We'll see in a few weeks with our new t-shirts, hopefully.
Bye.
See ya.